The sirens began at 3 in the morning, their wailing cry cutting through the February darkness like a knife through fabric. In London's East End, where the Thames curved the neighborhoods of brick row houses and narrow cobblestone streets, the sound had become as familiar as breathing. It was 1941, and the Blitz had transformed the city into a landscape of rubble and resilience, where entire blocks disappeared overnight, and survivors emerged each dawn to sweep glass from their doorsteps as if tidying up after an ordinary storm. In a second-floor flat on Bethnal Green Road, where the wallpaper was stained with soot and the windows were covered with blackout curtains and crisscross tape, a woman named Catherine Hayes was already awake. At 32 years old, she had the kind of face that inspired trust immediately, round and open with clear gray eyes that seemed to see directly into a person's soul. Her hands, strong and capable, were scrubbed clean despite the late hour, and her midwife's bag sat packed and ready by the door, as it always was. She had learned long ago that babies followed no schedule, respected no curfew, and certainly paid no attention to air raid sirens. When the siren started that morning, Catherine was drinking weak tea at her kitchen table, studying notes about a patient who was due any day now, a young woman barely 20 whose husband was somewhere in North Africa with the 8th Army. The sound of the sirens brought Catherine to her feet automatically, and she was reaching for her coat and bag when the telephone rang, its shrill bell cutting through the wail outside. The voice on the other end belonged to Mrs. Morrison, the neighborhood warden, and it was tight with urgency. "Catherine, it's a Feldman girl. She's gone into labor at the Bethnal Green shelter. Can you come?" Catherine didn't hesitate. "I'm on my way." She hung up, grabbed her bag and coat, and was out the door before the sirens had finished their first cycle. The streets were already filling with people, families clutching blankets and thermoses, children rubbing sleep from their eyes, everyone moving with the practiced efficiency of those who had done this too many times to count. The night was cold and clear, the kind of night that made good bombing weather because the German pilots could see their targets. Catherine moved against the flow of traffic, heading toward the Bethnal Green tube station, while everyone else was heading into it. The station had been converted into one of the largest public shelters in London, capable of holding thousands of people in its deep tunnels. It had become a subterranean city, complete with bunks, canteens, and a strange sense of community that formed among people who spent their nights huddled together waiting for the all-clear. Catherine had delivered 6 babies in that shelter over the past year, bringing new life into the world while bombs fell overhead, and each time she had marveled at the strange juxtaposition of birth and death, of hope and fear existing in the same moment. The entrance to the shelter was chaos, a river of humanity flowing down the stairs into the earth. Catherine pushed her way through, her midwife's bag held high, so people could see she had official business, calling out apologies as she squeezed past families settling onto the stairs because the platforms below were already full. The smell hit her as she descended. Unwashed bodies, damp wool, smoke from cigarettes, and underneath it all the distinctive metallic tang of the underground. The lighting was dim, bare bulbs strung along the tunnel ceiling casting shadows that made everyone look gaunt and exhausted. She found the Feldman girl, Rebecca, on the northbound platform, lying on a thin mattress someone had spread on the concrete, surrounded by a cluster of women who were doing their best to provide privacy with held-up blankets. Rebecca's face was slick with sweat despite the cold, her dark hair plastered to her forehead, and when she saw Catherine, she reached out with a hand that trembled. "I'm sorry," she gasped between contractions. "I didn't mean to cause trouble." Catherine knelt beside her, setting down her bag and taking Rebecca's hand in both of hers. "You're not causing trouble," she said firmly. "You're bringing a baby into the world, and there's nothing more important than that." She turned to the women holding the blankets. "I need boiling water, clean towels, and someone to keep people back. This girl needs room to breathe. If you've ever wondered what courage really looks like, if you've ever been moved by stories of ordinary people doing extraordinary things in impossible circumstances, then stay with this story. Hit that subscribe button, because Catherine Hayes' journey is just beginning, and what she does next will restore your faith in the power of one person to change dozens of lives. The baby came quickly, too quickly for a first birth, but Catherine had learned that war changed everything, even the rhythms of labor. Rebecca pushed with a determination born of desperation, wanting to bring her child into the world before the bombs started falling. as if she could somehow protect it through the force of her will alone. Catherine worked with practiced efficiency, her hands steady even as the ground above them shook from distant explosions, even as the lights flickered and the crowd in the tunnel pressed closer. She had done this 100 times in hospitals and homes, but never had she felt the weight of responsibility quite like she did in that moment, kneeling on a concrete platform with thousands of people watching, bringing life into a world that seemed determined to destroy it. The baby was a girl, small but healthy, and when she let out her first cry, the sound cut to the murmur of the crowd and brought a moment of complete silence. Then someone started clapping, and the applause spread to the tunnel like wildfire, hundreds of people celebrating this small victory over the darkness outside. Rebecca cried as Catherine placed the baby in her arms, and Catherine found herself crying too, overwhelmed by the beauty of the moment and the terrible fragility of it. She stayed with Rebecca until the all-clear sounded at dawn, monitoring both mother and baby, making sure there were no complications. By the time she climbed back up to street level, the sun was rising over a London transformed. A building 3 blocks from the shelter had taken a direct hit. Its facade collapsed into the street, and rescue workers were already digging through the rubble searching for survivors. Catherine stood for a moment, breathing in air thick with brick dust and smoke, and felt the familiar weight of survivors' guilt settle on her shoulders. She had been underground delivering a baby while people died above her. She had been celebrating life while death rained from the sky. It was a contradiction she couldn't resolve, a tension she carried with her as she walked home through streets littered with debris and broken glass. Her flat was untouched, though a bomb had fallen in the next street over, leaving a crater the size of a bus. Catherine made herself breakfast from her rations, weak tea and toast with scraping of margarine, and tried to sleep, but sleep wouldn't come. Her mind kept circling back to Rebecca and the baby, to the moment of the birth and the applause that had followed. She had helped bring 43 babies into the world since the Blitz began, each one a small act of defiance against the forces trying to destroy her city. But it wasn't enough. She felt it in her bones, a restless conviction that she needed to do more, be more, find some way to fight back against the tide of destruction. The answer came from an unexpected source. It was March, and Catherine was at the local church hall, where she ran a weekly prenatal clinic for expectant mothers in the neighborhood. The clinic was always crowded, women sitting on folding chairs in a room that smelled of boiled cabbage and damp wool, waiting their turn to be examined, to ask questions, to receive whatever comfort and guidance Catherine could provide. She had just finished examining a woman in her 8th month when Father Murphy, the elderly Irish priest who ran the church, pulled her aside. His face was grave, and he spoke in a low voice that didn't carry beyond the two of them. "Catherine, I need to speak with you about a sensitive matter. Can you come to my office?" She followed him to a small room behind the altar, where he closed the door and stood for a moment as if gathering his thoughts. "I've been contacted by representatives of the Jewish Refugee Committee," he said finally. "They're trying to evacuate children and families from occupied Europe, getting them out through various channels before it's too late. Some of these refugees are making it to England, but they're arriving with nothing. No papers, no money, nowhere to go. The committee is looking for people who can help, who can provide safe houses and assistance." He looked at Catherine with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. "They specifically asked if I knew any midwives or nurses who might be willing to help with pregnant women and mothers with young children. I thought of you immediately." Catherine's first instinct was to refuse. She was already stretched thin, working long hours at the clinic and responding to emergency calls at all hours, delivering babies in shelters and bombed-out buildings, living on ratios and exhaustion. She barely had time to take care of herself, let alone take on additional responsibilities. But even as these thoughts formed, she found herself saying, "What would I need to do?" Father Murphy's expression softened with relief. "For now, just be available for consultation. If a pregnant refugee arrives and needs medical care, they'd contact you. If a woman goes into labor and needs a midwife who could be discreet, they'd call you. Nothing more than you're already doing, really, just extending your services to include these refugees." He paused. "I should tell you that this work carries risks. The refugees are often here illegally, without proper documentation. The government officially supports refugee rescue efforts, But unofficially, there's a great deal of bureaucracy and red tape. Helping them could put you in a difficult position if questions are asked. Catherine thought about Rebecca and her baby, about the applause that had echoed to the shelter tunnel, about the 43 babies she had delivered in impossible circumstances. "Tell them yes," she said. "Tell them I'll help however I can." The first refugee Catherine met was a woman named Elsa Bergman, and she arrived on a rainy April evening with a belly swollen with child and eyes that had seen too much. She was German, a fact that made some people in the neighborhood hostile until they learned she was a Jew who had fled Berlin in 1938 after Kristallnacht. She had made it to Amsterdam, then to France, and finally, through a circuitous route involving fishing boats and forged documents, to England. She was 7 months pregnant, and she hadn't seen a doctor since leaving Berlin. Catherine examined her in the spare room of her flat, which she had hastily converted into a makeshift examination room, and found both mother and baby remarkably healthy, considering what Elsa had been through. But Elsa's hands shook constantly, and she flinched at loud noises, and when Catherine asked about the baby's father, Elsa's face closed down completely. "He didn't make it out," was all she would say. Catherine arranged for Elsa to stay with a family in the neighborhood, who had room, and she checked on her regularly over the following weeks. Elsa spoke little, but gradually a story emerged in fragments. A husband arrested and sent to a camp. A harrowing escape across multiple borders. Weeks hiding in basements and attics, never knowing if the next knock on the door would be the Gestapo. Catherine listened and provided what comfort she could, but she felt helpless in the face of such trauma. What comfort could she offer to someone who had lost everything? Elsa went into labor on a Tuesday afternoon in late May, and Catherine delivered her baby in the spare bedroom of the house where Elsa was staying. It was a boy, small but healthy, and when Elsa held it for the first time, she wept with a grief so profound that Catherine had to leave the room for a moment to compose herself. This was different from the other births she had attended. This baby represented not just hope, but also loss, a future built on the ruins of the past. Catherine stayed with Elsa for 3 days, helping her establish nursing, showing her how to care for the baby, and watching as Elsa slowly came back to life. On the 3rd day, as Catherine was preparing to leave, Elsa grabbed her hand. "You saved us," she said in heavily accented English. "Not just my baby. You saved us both. You gave me a reason to keep living." Catherine tried to brush off the gratitude, uncomfortable with such raw emotion, but Elsa wouldn't let her. "Please," she said, "there are others, so many others who need help. If you can do for them what you've done for me." She didn't finish the sentence, but she didn't need to. Catherine understood. She had found her purpose, the way she could fight back against the darkness. She would help the refugees, as many as she could reach, for as long as the war lasted. Word spread through the refugee network faster than Catherine could have imagined. Within weeks, she was being contacted regularly by the Jewish Refugee Committee, by church groups, by underground networks that operated in the shadows of wartime London. Could she examine a pregnant woman who had just arrived from Poland? Could she deliver a baby for a family hiding in a basement in Whitechapel? Could she provide medical care for a mother and infant who had nowhere else to turn? Catherine said yes to all of it, even when it meant working 20-hour days, even when it meant using her own rations to feed women who were starving, even when it meant taking risks that could have gotten her into serious trouble with the authorities. She delivered babies in the strangest places. A warehouse in the docks where a family was hiding, a church crypt, the back room of a kosher butcher shop that served as a safe house. She learned to work quickly and quietly, to ask no questions about papers or documentation, to provide care without judgment or hesitation. The refugees came from everywhere: Poland, Germany, Austria, France, Holland, Belgium. They had endured things Catherine couldn't begin to imagine. Concentration camps, forced labor, violent pogroms, desperate escapes across hostile territory. Many arrived malnourished and traumatized, carrying children or pregnant with babies who had been conceived in hiding or in camps. Catherine treated them all with the same gentle efficiency, the same unwavering commitment to their well-being. She became known in the refugee community as someone who could be trusted, someone who would help without asking for anything in return. By the summer of 1941, Catherine had helped deliver 17 babies to refugee mothers, and she had provided prenatal care to dozens more. The work consumed her life completely. She gave up her position at the hospital where she had worked part-time, focusing entirely on her private practice and her work with the refugees. She stopped attending social events, stopped trying to maintain friendships that required time and energy she didn't have. Her world narrowed to a cycle of births and clinic hours and emergency calls, punctuated by air raids and the constant anxiety of wartime existence. She lost weight, her clothes hanging loose on a frame that had never been heavy to begin with. Her hands developed a permanent tremor from fatigue, and she had to force herself to eat and sleep, her body running on adrenaline and willpower alone. The other midwives in the area began to worry about her, staging something of an intervention one afternoon in July. They cornered her at the church hall after clinic hours and told her in no uncertain terms that she was going to burn out if she didn't slow down. Catherine listened to their concerns with a patience she didn't feel, and then she told them what she had never articulated before, not even to herself. "I have to do this," she said simply. "These women have lost everything. Their homes, their families, their countries. All they have left is the hope that they can build something new, that their children can have a future. If I can help make that possible, then I have to try. I have to." The turning point came in August, when Catherine was contacted about a situation that was more complicated than anything she had dealt with before. A group of refugees, 15 people in total, including 7 children and 3 pregnant women, had arrived in London through a particularly dangerous route involving a sea crossing from France. They had no papers, no money, and nowhere to go. The organizations that usually help with resettlement were overwhelmed, and there was a real risk that the group would be detained by authorities and potentially deported. Catherine was asked if she could help, if she knew of any place where they could stay temporarily until more permanent arrangements could be made. She thought about it for all of 5 seconds before deciding that she would take them into her own flat. It was absurd, really. Her flat had 3 rooms, a main room that served as living room and bedroom, a tiny kitchen, and a bathroom. There was no possible way to house 15 people in such a space. But Catherine had learned during the Blitz that impossible was just a word, that people could adapt to anything if they had to. She cleared out her main room, pushing her own bed against the wall and borrowing mattresses and blankets from neighbors who asked no questions. She stocked her kitchen with as much food as her ration books would allow, supplemented by donations from the Refugee Committee. And on a warm August evening, she opened her door to 15 exhausted, frightened people and welcomed them into her home. The logistics were a nightmare. 15 people sharing a bathroom, taking turns cooking in a kitchen built for one, sleeping in shifts because there wasn't enough floor space for everyone to lie down at once. The flat was always loud, always crowded, always thick with the smells of cooking and unwashed bodies in fear. Catherine's privacy disappeared completely. She couldn't have a private conversation, couldn't take a bath without scheduling it, couldn't sleep more than a few hours at a time, because someone was always awake, always crying or talking or moving around. It should have been unbearable. It should have broken her. Instead, Catherine found herself strangely energized by the chaos. These people needed her, not just as a midwife, but as a protector, an advocate, a lifeline to safety. She threw herself into the task of caring for them with the same determination she brought to everything else. She registered the children with a local school under false names, claiming they were evacuees from the countryside. She found work for the men with sympathetic employers who didn't ask too many questions. She provided medical care for the pregnant women, monitoring their progress and preparing for the inevitable births. She became not just their midwife, but their translator, their guide in navigating British bureaucracy, their connection to a world that often seemed hostile or indifferent to their plight. And slowly, over the weeks, she began to understand the true scope of what was happening in Europe, the systematic destruction of an entire people that the refugees spoke about in whispers and fragments. The first of the 3 pregnant women gave birth in September, a difficult labor that lasted 18 hours and left Catherine exhausted beyond measure. The baby was a girl, tiny and perfect, and the mother named her Catherine in honor of the woman who had saved them. Catherine held that baby and felt something break open inside her, a dam of emotion she had been holding back for months. She cried, standing in her own flat surrounded by refugees, holding a baby named after her, and she couldn't stop crying for nearly an hour. All the fear and exhaustion and stress of the past year poured out of her, and when it was finally over, she felt hollow and light, as if she had purged something toxic from her system. The refugees gathered around her, offering comfort in a dozen different languages, and she understood in that moment that she had become part of something larger than herself, part of a community bound together by shared trauma and shared hope. She was no longer just helping these people. She had become one of them, linked by bonds stronger than blood. The second baby came in October, and the third in November, both healthy despite the difficult circumstances. By December, Catherine had helped all 15 of her residents find more permanent housing and employment, working with the Refugee Committee and sympathetic locals to create a network of support that would sustain them through the years ahead. As her flat emptied out and her life slowly returned to something approaching normal, Catherine felt not relief but a strange sense of loss. The chaos had become her purpose, and without it she felt adrift. But the Refugee Committee had other plans for her. In January of 1942, she was invited to a meeting at a nondescript office building in Bloomsbury, where she met with officials who explained that her work had been noticed, that she had developed a reputation within the refugee community as someone who could be trusted with difficult cases. They wanted to formalize her involvement, to make her part of an official network that rescued and resettled refugees. The work would be dangerous, they warned. It would require her to take risks, to break laws, to operate in the gray areas between official policy and humanitarian necessity. Catherine didn't hesitate. "I'll do it," she said. "Whatever you need, I'll do it." And so began the most intense period of Catherine's war. 2 years during which she became deeply involved in refugee rescue operations. She worked with underground networks that smuggled people out of occupied Europe, with forgers who created false documents, with sympathetic officials who looked the other way when irregular arrivals needed help. She used her position as a midwife as cover, traveling to ports and railway stations ostensibly to provide medical care, but actually to meet refugees and guide them to safety. She delivered babies in hiding places across southern England, in farmhouses and warehouses and church basements, always working quickly and quietly, always disappearing before questions could be asked. She became skilled at deception, at creating plausible cover stories, at reading people to determine who could be trusted and who couldn't. It was exhilarating and terrifying in equal measure, a high-wire act that demanded complete focus and nerves of steel. Catherine discovered reserves of courage she hadn't known she possessed, found herself capable of lying to authorities, and taking risks that would have seemed impossible before the war. She was arrested twice, once by local police who suspected her of smuggling, and once by immigration officials who questioned why she was meeting with undocumented refugees. Both times she talked her way out of trouble, using her status as a respected midwife and her connections to church groups as shields. But the arrests left her shaken, aware of how close she was to real danger, how easily her work could end in prison or worse. The stress took its toll. Catherine developed insomnia, lying awake night after night running through scenarios and contingency plans, worrying about the people she was helping and the risks they were all taking. She lost more weight, her face becoming gaunt and her eyes hollow. She started smoking, something she had never done before, and found herself going through a pack a day just to calm her nerves. The physical toll was matched by the emotional burden of the stories she heard. Every refugee she met had a tale of loss and survival that would haunt her for the rest of her life. She heard about families torn apart, about children hidden with strangers while parents were sent to camps, about desperate escapes under cover of darkness, about the systematic brutality of the Nazi regime. She heard these stories and felt the weight of them accumulating in her soul, like stones in a pocket, pulling her down even as she tried to stay afloat. There were moments when she wanted to quit, when the burden felt too heavy to carry. But then she would deliver another baby, would see another mother's face light up with hope, would help another family find safety, and she would remember why she was doing this. Each person she saved was a victory against the darkness, a small act of resistance that mattered more than she could measure. By the end of 1943, Catherine had personally assisted 45 refugees, helping them escape danger and find new lives in England. 45 people who might otherwise have died, who now had a chance at survival because a midwife from London's East End had decided that delivering babies was enough, that she needed to do more. The number seemed both enormous and inadequate. 45 people saved against millions murdered. It was a drop in the ocean, a gesture so small as to be almost meaningless in the face of such vast evil. And yet Catherine knew, with a certainty that sustained her through the darkest moments, that it wasn't meaningless to those 45 people. To them, it was everything. The war in Europe ended in May of 1945, and when it came the full revelation of the Holocaust horrors, the newsreels from the liberated camps showed atrocities that shocked even people who had been hearing refugee stories for years. Catherine watched the footage from Bergen-Belsen and Auschwitz and felt physically ill, understanding for the first time the full scope of what the refugees had been fleeing from, the fate she had helped some of them avoid. She thought about Elsa and the baby boy she had delivered, about the 15 refugees who had lived in her flat, about all the others she had helped over the years. Some of them had family members who didn't make it out, who died in the camps or the ghettos or the mass executions. The survivors carried guilt and grief that would never fully heal, wounds that went too deep for even time to mend. Catherine continued her work with refugees after the war ended, helping survivors who came to England searching for lost family members or starting over with nothing. The work was different now, less dangerous but somehow more heartbreaking. These survivors had endured the worst humanity had to offer, and they emerged broken in ways Catherine didn't know how to fix. She delivered their babies and provided medical care and listened to their stories, offering what comfort she could, even knowing it would never be enough. She was honored by the Jewish Refugee Committee in 1947, receiving a commendation for her wartime service. The ceremony was held in a synagogue in North London, and Catherine sat in the front row feeling awkward and out of place, surrounded by survivors who had far more right to recognition than she did. But when the rabbi called her name and asked her to stand, when the congregation rose to their feet in applause, when survivor after survivor approached to thank her and shake her hand, she felt a swell of emotion that threatened to overwhelm her. These people were alive because of choices she had made, because she had said yes when others said no, because she had taken risks and worked herself to exhaustion and refused to look away from suffering. It mattered. It had all mattered. The decades that followed were quieter, but no less purposeful. Catherine continued working as a midwife well into her 60s, delivering babies for children of refugees she had helped during the war, watching families grow and thrive in a country that had given them shelter. She never married, never had children of her own, her life consumed entirely by her work and the community she had helped build. She lived modestly in the same flat in Bethnal Green, which had been rebuilt after the war, and she remained active in refugee resettlement work even as she grew older. She wrote letters on behalf of people seeking asylum, testified at hearings, and provided character references for countless individuals navigating the immigration system. In 1968, she was invited to Israel by a group of survivors she had helped, all of whom had eventually immigrated there after the war. They took her to Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Memorial Museum, and showed her the wall of names where millions of victims were recorded. Then they took her to a different section, where rescuers were honored, and she was stunned to discover that her name was there, inscribed on a wall alongside others who had risked their lives to save Jews during the Holocaust. The designation of righteous among the nations, an honor she had never sought and didn't feel she deserved, but one that the survivors insisted she had earned. She stood in front of that wall, reading her own name among the honored, and felt the full weight of her life's work settle on her shoulders. 45 people saved, countless babies delivered in impossible circumstances, a lifetime spent in service to others, guided by nothing more complicated than the belief that every life mattered, that helping was always better than looking away. Catherine Hayes died in 1982 at the age of 73, her passing marked by obituaries that called her a war hero and a humanitarian. Her funeral was attended by dozens of people whose lives she had touched, including survivors she had helped and their children and grandchildren. They came to pay respects to a woman who had seen the worst of humanity and responded with the best of herself, who had brought life into a world consumed by death, who had never stopped believing that one person could make a difference. The babies Catherine delivered during the Blitz grew up and had children of their own, creating families that stretched across generations. The refugees she rescued built lives in England and Israel and America, their survival a testament to her courage and compassion. 45 people saved directly, but the number of lives touched was immeasurable when you counted children and grandchildren, when you consider the ripple effects of survival. Catherine understood, in a way that few people do, that saving one life meant saving entire worlds of possibility, entire futures that would otherwise have been erased. Her story is not unique. During World War II, countless ordinary people did extraordinary things, rising to meet challenges that seemed insurmountable, finding reserves of courage and compassion in themselves they didn't know existed. Midwives and doctors, teachers and priests, factory workers and farmers, all of them contributing in ways large and small to the defeat of fascism and the survival of those targeted for destruction. Catherine Hayes was one of them, distinguished only by the particular way her skills aligned with the needs of the moment, by the specific circumstances that called forth her heroism. She was, in many ways, an ordinary woman who found herself in extraordinary circumstances and chose to act rather than to hide, to help rather than to turn away. If Catherine's story has moved you, if you felt the weight of her choices and the courage of her convictions, then you understand why these stories matter. History isn't just about battles and generals, about grand strategies and political decisions. It's also about the people who worked in the margins, who saved lives one at a time, who brought light into darkness through simple acts of human decency. Catherine Hayes delivered babies in bomb shelters, and in doing so, she delivered hope. She rescued 45 refugees, and in doing so, she rescued the possibility of a future that included their voices, their contributions, their descendants. Her life reminds us that we all have the capacity to make a difference, that heroism isn't always dramatic or visible, that sometimes the most important work is done quietly, in the spaces between official recognition and public acclaim. If this story resonated with you, take a moment to like this video. Let me know you made it to the end by commenting, "Delivered with Hope." And if you want to hear more stories like Catherine's, stories of courage and compassion that deserve to be remembered, then subscribe to this channel. There are so many more women whose stories need to be told, whose lives challenge us to be better, to do more, to never stop believing in the power of one person to change the world. Thank you for being here, for listening, for caring about these stories. Another remarkable woman's story is waiting just one click away, another life that will inspire and challenge you. Until then, remember Catherine, and remember that delivering hope is something we can all do in whatever circumstances we find ourselves.